So welcome everyone to this second session of the DevCon on the Acumatica Web Services. Today we'll mostly be covering the contract-based REST API. So, and what else I'll try to do at first is I try to regroup pretty much like all sorts of keywords that we can hear when we are talking about the Acumatica REST web services, and I'll display them all on the screen, all jumbled up, and we'll try to go through all of them in a way that makes sense. Once that's done, we'll switch from the boring PowerPoint and go with Postman in order to do some live demos of these requests and how they work, how to use them, and what's the expected result that you can get from them. And at the end, a couple of sneak peeks on what's coming for the Acumatica REST API. So if I start with like all the various concepts and try to put them like in display for you to see, we have all of these. So we have like delete user-defined fields, validate entity, refresh token, system fields, some node, custom field. All these are things that you can hear potentially when you're dealing with the Acumatica web service, and sometimes it might get a bit confusing. So we'll try to categorize them and then give us some meaning besides each of these keywords so that you can then leave this session with a better understanding and be on your way to start using them appropriately and to build your own solution using this. So first of all, if we mention the keyword endpoints, what here can be related to endpoints? So basically, if we remove all the keywords that aren't removed, here's those that are left. So we have entity, extended endpoint, endpoint, custom endpoint, generic inquiries that you can put inside the endpoint, and we also have like validate endpoint and validate entity. We also have like the system contract. So what each of these are. So basically, the endpoint right here is the entry point inside of Acumatica. So it's the definition or the grouping of all the screens or data sets that you can access using the contract-based REST API. Each endpoint is assigned a system contract, which you might have seen it, you might not have seen it, it might have been passed silently in the back. It's not something that you need to deal with. It defines the list of methods available for each entity that is present inside of the endpoint. I mentioned like what's an endpoint, then what's a custom endpoint versus an extended endpoint. Usually when we talk about a custom endpoint, it's a new endpoint that's created from scratch, that's not using any of the endpoints as a base that already exist in the system. And usually these will use the latest version of the system contract by default. You don't need to specify it. It's going to take this one as by default. An extended endpoint is an endpoint that you create while using another one as a base. So for example, if we have the default endpoint and we want to extend it, we will be giving it a new name, a new version, and that new endpoint will have inside of it, at the moment of its creation, everything that is present in its base endpoint, which in this case would be the default endpoint. Now entities will switch from the endpoint itself to what's inside of the endpoint. So inside of the endpoint, we have what we call entities, which are the node or data points inside of the endpoint that corresponds to a graph of a screen inside of that we can access. So a bit like Nayan was mentioning earlier, the business logic or the screen that was like on the second point of the logic to deal with. So we had the presentation layer on top, which was either the UI or the web service. Then the entity corresponds to the business logic or the graph that you can deal with using the web services. And once you've created your endpoint, you might be tempted to validate it in order to make sure that everything inside of it is designed properly. In order to do this, you have two options available to you. You have the validate endpoint action or the validate entity. Both of those accomplish the same set of validation. It's just that the validate endpoint will validate through all of the endpoint, while the validate entity will only be validating the one entity that you have selected. So for example, if you've created a custom endpoint, you might want to use the validate endpoint as you need to validate all of it. But if you've extended an endpoint, you might want to just use the validate entity on the entities that you have either added or modified from the base so that it doesn't go through the whole list of entities which could be present in the base endpoint, which could be extensive. And generic inquiries, I just wanted to put it in here because it will become an entity like is mentioned above. The only advantage of it is that as part of the, I think the latest version of the default endpoint, which was introduced in Acumatica 2020 R2, the generic inquiries, once you try to add them to an endpoint, they will be automatically mapped. So I'll be able to show you a bit later what it should look like, but you will, once you've selected the generic inquiry to be added to the endpoint, it will have a main entity and a sub-entity. In the main entity for it, you will find the parameters that this generic inquiry might have, if it has any. If it doesn't, this top level will be empty. And in the detail subpart, you will find all the fields that would be present in the result grid of the generic inquiry. Now, we've covered pretty much everything that was related to the endpoint. Now let's move over to the types of requests that you can perform through the web service, through the contract-based API REST, or what requests you can use with it. So in here, let's make all the other concepts disappear. We have 4 types of requests that we can use. So we have the get, the put, the post, and the delete requests. Now, what are these good for? What can they be used? So very simply, get can be used to retrieve either a single record or a list of records. The put method or put request can be used to create a record, to update a record, or to delete a detail line of a record. So basically, not the whole record, but a record of this as part of a sub-entity of that main record. So for example, if we're talking about sales order, a detailed record here would be a sales order detail or an SO line. The post type of request is used for 3 things. So the login request, the logout request, and the actions or triggering of an action on a specific screen. And the delete type of request is, of course, to delete a record, but the whole record in itself. So the top main part and everything that might be a child of that top record. So for example, once again, if we take the sales order as an example, it would be deleting the sales order and every detail that it is attached to it. If the sales order, of course, is in a state where it can be deleted. If it's already in the shipping state or something like this, it will not allow you to delete it, of course. Now, we have covered types of requests, and let's see how we can authenticate ourselves, or when we are talking about authentication, what keywords can be referred to this. So here they are. We have, of course, sessions, cookies, token, refresh tokens. We have OAuth 2.0, flows and scope. How do they group? How do they interact? Here we go. So we have first, like a small architecture like this. We have the basic login and logout request. And then we also have the second method to authenticate ourselves, which is OAuth 2.0, in which you can use 3 different types of flows. So the password credential flow, the implicit flow, or the authorization code flow. For each of these flow, you have different scopes that you can define and that will provide you with different functionalities. So but let me just go back to the top. So for the login and logout requests, once you perform the login requests, the session or the session information that proves that you're properly authenticated will be stored in the cookies, and which are returned as part of the response to the login request. And if you want to perform other requests, so for example, once you've logged in, you want to perform either get request, put request, post request to trigger actions, you will need to pass these cookies along so that the request is properly authenticated. And once you're finished doing all the actions that you want to perform, do not forget to perform the logout request. We'll see a bit later when we talk about the license why this is important. Now for the OAuth 2.0, all three flows, so the password, the implicit, and the authorization code, will provide you with a token which is associated with the session. And then if you want to perform other requests like the get, the put, and the post to trigger actions, you just need to pass along that token in order to prove that you have authenticated properly. Now with the scopes, so we had, like I mentioned, three scopes. We have the API scope, the offline access scope, and the API concurrent access. So the API scope is a scope that's just required, that you're required to provide if you want to be able to perform any API requests. Like you can, if you don't want to, use the OAuth 2.0 to get a token without providing the API scope. But as soon as you try to use that token to perform any API request, then you will get an error mentioning that this token is not authorized to perform said actions. This can be used if you want to use token, for example, in OData. But if you want to use the OAuth token for API requests, you absolutely need the API scope. The offline access is used to when you perform the OAuth token request and you provide the offline access scope, you will be provided with a refresh token. This refresh token is valid for a period of a month since the original request that you use to get the first token. So for example, if I were to perform a request, an OAuth request, and retrieve a token and also a refresh token on today, which is June 15th. And let's say once I'm done using the token, I don't have anything else to do today or tomorrow, then next week I use the refresh token to get a new token and a new refresh token. That new refresh token will not have a refresh period of a month. It will be a month since the original moment where we retrieve the token, which was June 15th. So it will have the same expiration date as the previous refresh token. And thus, after a period of a month, you will have to perform the original OAuth request to get a new token and a new refresh token from scratch again. And you have the API concurrent access scope, which makes it so that your token, the request that you make on your token will be able to use multiple sessions inside of the system. Okay, that is pretty much it for the authentication part. Now, once we know our request, we've authenticated yourself, what kind of parameters can we pass along with our request that we're making? So we have pretty much, I'll say 5, even though there's 6, because the top and skip parameter are very frequently grouped together as one. So we have the select parameter, the expand parameter, the filter, the custom, and the top and skip. So the expand parameter is used when you want to retrieve one of the sub-entities or one detailed record associated with a given business object. So you have the main entity that you'll be targeting, for example, sales order again. And if you want to see its detail, its shipment, or any other of its sub-entities, you would need to expand that particular sub-entity. The filter parameter, pretty much as its name implies, is used to add conditions to the request that you're performing in order to retrieve different records. The select parameter is used to reduce the amount of data that you are being returned for a specific record. So for example, once again, you perform a request on the sales order, but you're not interested in having the whole list of fields that's present in the endpoint. You only want, let's say, 4 or 5. You can use the select parameter to restrict that amount so that your request size becomes smaller, and you can then process it faster after this. Then we have the top and skip parameters, which are used to create some sort of pagination system when you're trying to retrieve a large amount of record. So for example, the top parameter will be used to retrieve the first X amount of number of records that you want. For example, we say top 1000, it will retrieve you the first 1000 records. And the skip will be used to skip an X amount of records at the start of the list. So if you combine both of them, let's say top 1000 skip 4000, it would skip the first 4000 records and then return you the next 1000. So the 4001 until the 4001 until the 5000 record. So this way you can retrieve huge amounts of data in smaller chunks so that the request processes faster, and your process also responds a bit faster than waiting for the whole list that could be thousands or tens of thousands of records long. And we also have, at last, the custom parameter, which can be used to retrieve fields that are present on the screen or present in the data access class that are used on the screen, but that are not defined inside of the endpoint. Now that we've talked about parameters, let's go over and talk about like different types of fields that you might have heard regarding the REST API. So we have, beside like all the fields that are defined in the endpoint, we have like user-defined fields, we have key fields, system fields, the custom fields, the note and the file fields. What are these? What are they used for? So key fields, they're usually the fields that provide a unique combination to identify a specific record and that are used in Acumatica screens to navigate to that specific record. So for example, once again, let me take the sales order example. If we have first sales order that we'll take a look later, there's 2 key fields. So there's the order type and the order number, and you need to use both in order to navigate to a specific sales order. Well, if we're talking about customers, the key field in this case would be the customer ID. Usually these fields are the ones that are at the top leftmost section of any Acumatica form, as they are the first one that you would see if you were trying to read a page that you can use to navigate to a specific record in order to consult it. Now, custom fields, like I mentioned, it's fields that are not present in the entity definition. And as a subtract of this, we have user-defined fields that are attributes that can be added dynamically to specific screens. And if you want to target them using the custom field section, you will need to use them using their attribute ID and the keyword attribute that you would put in front. So I'll show an example later, but in this case, as an example shown just here, we could target the color attribute by using the custom field parameter with the attribute color keyword. Now, we also have like system fields, which are fields that are not visible in the entity definition. So if you were to take a look at any entity inside of the web service endpoint, you would be able to see a list of fields defined in them. System fields would not be present in any of them as they're part of the system contract, but if you were to perform any request, either get request or put request, you would see these fields being added to your response from Acumatica. So, and these fields, you have 5 of them. We have an ID field, we have a row number, the note field, we have the file field, and we also have like a custom section field, which is a section in which you will find the custom field if you request any. Now, if we go to various headers that you might encounter while using Acumatica REST API, we have 4 of them that you should be able to encounter. 2 of them very frequent, while 2 of them you might not have heard of them, but they're there if you want to use them. So we have the content type headers, which is used to specify the format of the request body that you're providing to Acumatica. The accept header is used to specify the format of the response that you expect. And now we have, which these 2 were the most frequent one, and usually the required ones for any types of API requests. And you also have the 2 that are a bit more obscure that you might not have heard of, which is the if match and the if non-match. If you were to specify, and they're not mandatory at all. The 2 last ones, they're just if you want to customize a bit the behavior of your request. So if you were to specify the if match, you can change the behavior of any put request, which is used to normally either update or create a record, to make sure that this request only performs the update operation. If it's not able to perform an update and would normally switch into the behavior of creating a new record, the request will be denied because you have specified this header. And we have, on the opposite side, the if non-match. So that changes the behavior of the put request so that you can only use create operations. So once again, if you're trying to create a new record and you specify enough information, for example, a customer ID and everything, and while specifying the customer ID, the system detects that a customer already exists with that customer ID, so the request would then switch from a create request to an update. Then the system will throw an error telling you that a record with this value already exists. And these were pretty much the headers that you can use with the REST API. Now for the license, of course, there's just license, but we'll take a look a bit more as to what you can find. So if we were to take a look inside of Acumatica at the license monitoring console and try to find like the information that's targeted at the web service, we have 3 system constraints that matter. We have the maximum number of web service API user, the maximum number of concurrent web service API requests, and the maximum number of web service API requests per minute. So let me just go a bit more in detail regarding each of them. So the maximum number of web service API user is the maximum amount of API sessions that can be connected at the same time. So when I was mentioning earlier the login and the logout request, these sessions is the moment where you are between a login and a logout, or when you've started to use a token before you perform a logout request on it while using that token. And the maximum number of web service API users is the maximum amount of sessions that you can have connected on a system at once. If you have more than this, then you will encounter an error that's telling you maximum, I think, API login limit reached, or a message that sounds something like this, though I'll be able to display it a bit later. The maximum number of concurrent web service API requests is the maximum amount of requests that you can perform simultaneously using the REST API. So basically, you can have multiple sessions that are connected at the same time, and usually they can send requests, but the system will only be dealing with three, with this in this specific scenario, with 3 requests at the time. There is a queue that can store more requests if it happens that you have, for example, 4 or 5 that happens simultaneously, or that happens when other requests are being dealt with. So it can store a bit, and then once a spot for these 3 concurrent requests frees up, it's going to take the next one from the queue. And we also have the maximum number of web service API requests per minute, which in this case is 100. And it's pretty much as is written right here. It's the maximum number of web service requests you can perform each minute. And there is a small logic in here, once again, that there's a queue. So if you go over the 100 requests or your limit per minute, it will put requests in the queue and wait for the next minute. Though if there's a limit to this queue, though if you were to send more requests than is allowed and go over the queue, you might get an error there. Okay. And now the only keyword that we haven't covered in this case is Postman, and that means basically that we are done with, let's say, the boring PowerPoint part, and we jump into the more interesting demo part. So in this demo section, this is just a small reminder for myself. So try to go over the endpoint, various authentication method, types of requests, and parameters. But if I go right here, let's me connect to the Acumatica website, go to the web service endpoint screen by typing web at the top, or by noticing that it is in the integration section. And more item, navigate to the, can't seem to, oh, here it is, integration section, showing everything in here, and go to the preference section and the web service endpoint screen right here. This brings us to this list of endpoints that we have available in the system. Let me select the default endpoint of version 2020. And here in the tree view right here is the endpoint definition. So we have the endpoint main node at the top with all the entities defined inside of it. So we have the endpoint name version, the endpoint, the endpoint name, the endpoint version, and the system contract that is being used. In this case, it's system contract version 4. If you are interested in knowing more about the difference between the different version of the system contract, you can go to our help.acumatica.com website, navigate to the, at the bottom to the integration development guide, go to the configuring REST API section, endpoints and contracts, and here we have comparisons of version contracts, where you can see difference between the different system contracts. Now, if we take a look at one of these entities, so for example, I was talking about the sales order earlier, they are all in alphabetical order. So I'll find the sales order right here. And we can see that this entity right here corresponds to a specific screen. So the screen name is sales order, the screen ID is the SO31000. And we have all of these fields that are pre-configured as part of the default endpoint. And if we were to open the node, we can see that there's even some actions that are pre-configured and some subnodes. And I was talking about the details earlier. So the details for the sales order, which also have a lot of fields defined for it. And you might notice one thing, that the insert, delete, save, delete, adding new fields, populate, extending the entity are all disabled. This is because this endpoint is provided out of the box by Acumatica, and you're not allowed to modify this endpoint. If you want to perform some add some functionalities to it, add some more fields, add some new screens, you will need to use the extend endpoint button at the top, which gives you the base endpoint information. In our case, the default endpoint version 20.200.001. We just need to give it a new name, a new version, and click OK, and we will end up with a new endpoint. I already have one, so let me select my default plus endpoint. And you can see now that the delete, the extend, the insert here are now enabled. And it would allow me, for example, if I select my sales order again, to extend an entity and add fields to it. Though if you want to add field, while you can add a line like this and manually type, I strongly recommend that you use the populate button, as this will provide you a list of all the sections inside of the sales order screen with the fields that are not yet in that specific entity. So for example, the top level of the sales order is usually the summary section. So in this case, the order summary. And right here, we have all the fields that are not yet in the top level sales order summary, sales order entity, I should say. One thing that might have happened a bit quickly is that when I clicked on the extend entity button right here, the small arrow pointing down that you can see right here next to sales order disappeared. Let me just cancel this so we can see it come back. This small arrow right here just represents that the entity next to it has not been modified from its base endpoint. So as we can see right here, the sales order would be identical to the sales order entity that is present in the base endpoint of this extended endpoint, which is the default endpoint. Okay, now let us jump to Postman with the collection of requests. So let me zoom a tiny bit so we can see a bit better. So first, let's start with our login request. So login requests, a lot of requests will start with, well, all of the requests, I should say, will start with the same base, which is why I've stored this in a variable that's going to be explained a bit more in detail in a future presentation, which is, I think, from my colleague Vartini with the tips and tricks. But we see here I'm storing the name of my server, which is localhost, and the name of the website, which in my case is 2022 R104. And after this, we have the entity keyword, which is present for most requests, not all of them, but most. And we have the AUTH/login for the login request. The login request, like I had mentioned, is a post type of request. And I need to provide it with a name and a password. These two are mandatory information, of course. The tenant, if you're only using a single tenant, is not mandatory. But if you're using multiple tenants, I strongly recommend that you use it. Branch as well is not mandatory, though if you want to use a different branch than the default one for that specific user, I recommend that you mention it during the login period. And the locale. So let me send this request right here. And we get back a 204 no content, which means we have successfully logged in inside of Acumatica. And if we were to take a look at cookies, we do see that we have various cookies, though I think we have a bit short, but we have like ASP.NET Session, ESPX AUTH, which are what we need to pass along the next request in order to authenticate them properly. Thankfully, Postman does this automatically. So in order to test requests, a lot of people that are developing their own system to send a request, test their request in their system first. I like to tell them, test it using Postman as it's separate, and you're sure that if you're facing an issue, the issue is coming from the request and not from the system sending the request. Now that we've performed a post request to authenticate ourselves, we can start performing some request. So for example, in this case, I'm trying to retrieve a list of sales orders while using the filter parameter on the customer ID field of the sales order screen. So for example, if I navigate to the sales order screen, we are trying to retrieve all the sales order that would have a specific customer. So in this case, we use the filter parameter, customer ID using the EQ keyword for equal, and provide the value for customer, or for the customer ID. We send this request, we get a 200 OK for a successful response. And we do see that we get a square bracket representing an array of result. And we get multiple sales order right here. All of them will have the customer ID being equal to a bartend. Now, if I want to select a specific sales order using the key fields, I could use, once again, the filter in order to target these specific key fields, which in this case, if I navigate to the sales order screen, the two key fields are like I had mentioned, at the topmost leftmost field, so the order type and the order number, because when you change values inside of these, you navigate to a specific record. If I were to change the type or the order number, the information displayed would change. And now if I go back to Postman, for the key fields, you can specify them directly in the URL at the top of the screen. In the URL of Postman, in the order that they show up on the screen. So if we go back to our sales order, we have order type first and then order number. If I specify the value, so SO and the order number afterward, and I send this, we can see that once again, we have a 200 OK stated as a response, and we do not have an array being returned to us. We have a single sales order that's being returned, and it is the order that corresponded. So we have our order type SO and our order number, which is 6541, which is exactly the one that we had specified. Now, if we want, for example, let me just fetch this right here. If we want to retrieve a specific sales order, but we're not interested, like I mentioned, in all of the fields that are present there, we can use the select to reduce the amount of fields that are being returned to us. And you can see right here, I specified the order number, the order type, the customer ID, and the customer order number on the screen. And in this case, for this specific order, I did not have any customer order, but if we type DevCon right here and save, and resend the request right here, we will see that we have our order type, our order number, our customer ID. Come on. And we have now our customer order number value that we just entered, the DevCon. So now if we are trying to restrict the amount of the quantity of record that we're retrieving, like I mentioned earlier, we have the top and the skip option available. So if I were to use the top 10 parameter, I restricted the fields just so we can see a bit better which sales order are being returned. But we do see we have like a CS 1558, CS 1559, 1560. And if we were to use the combination of skip and top, so for example, in this case, I do say top 10 and skip 10 and send this request. we do arrive right here with the CS1568, which if we scrolled at the bottom, so the top 10 was ending at 1567, and then we start at 1568. So just like this, you can create a paginated type of response, and you can restrict the amount of information that you're requesting with Acumatica. Now we've played with sales order, but we haven't tried to take a look at what's inside of the sales order. So in this case, our magnificent kit of Lego with 500 pieces inside of it. So if we were to take a look again at the time we retrieve the sales order, we don't see any detail of it inside of it. That's because by default, Acumatica does not provide you any information of subentities unless you request it. And in order to do this, you need to use the expand parameter with the name of the sub-entity that you're trying to retrieve. And let me reload the web service endpoint screen just for a bit later. And if we were to send this request, let me use the same sales order. If we scroll right here, we'll see that a detail section has appeared, which here as well contains an array. Though in this case, we only have a single detail, but it's still an array of detail. And we'll be able to see if we scroll down that it is our Lego set, Lego 500-piece set right here. And if you want to know like what name to use in order to expand, you can easily come into the web service endpoint, open it, and it is the name on the left part of the line that represents the sub-entity that you need to use. So in our case, it's details. Now we'll be using the custom value, and like I was mentioning a bit earlier about user-defined fields and what they are. So we have under the customization menu, we can manage user-defined fields and add attributes on the fly without any customization project to the screen. So let me just add the color attribute because I like my sales order to have a specific color. And for the same sales order, I'll come in here and let's say this sales order, let's say it's a black sales order. So now if we want to retrieve that specific user-defined field that we just added, of course, it's not present in the endpoint. So we could extend an endpoint and add it inside of the endpoint definition. But if you have only one or two fields, it might be beneficial for you to use the custom parameter instead so that you don't have to maintain a version of the endpoint yourself. Though if you want to add new screens, for sure there you will have to extend an endpoint. But for just a few fields, you can use the custom parameter right here. And like I had mentioned a bit earlier, for the in order to use the custom parameter, we need to specify the name of the field, but also the view in which it is. So if we were to use the customization menu and inspect an element, we can see the name of the view for it. And like I had mentioned, these user-defined fields are attribute, and we need to use the attribute keyword with the attribute ID. So this attribute ID was color. So we'll use the document view dot attribute keyword color in order to retrieve the value for it. So if I were to send it, wrong sale, cancel the request, wrong sales order. And we have right here a 200 OK response. And if we scroll down completely at the bottom, because the custom section will always be at the bottom, we do see that in the document view, we have the attribute color, which is a type custom string, and we have the value black. So we have our value that isn't present in the endpoint, but we can still retrieve it using the custom attribute right here. So now let me use a put request in order to create a a sales order. So if we take a look at the sales order screen, let's click on the plus sign. We do see that customer field is required. So of course we need to specify one. Location as well is required, but it is defaulted from customer. So unless you want to change the default value, no need to specify it. And then we can add an item. We would need to specify the inventory. Unit of measure will be automatically taken from the inventory, and we'll specify the quantity as well. So let me just go back to the sales order listing. So we have our latest one, which is the 6542. If I were to send this request where I specify the customer ID, and in the detail I specify 2 items, so the Acer computer with a quantity of 1 and the Lego set with a quantity of 2 and the order type sales SO. We do see that a sales order was created. We don't see the details because I hadn't specified the expand parameter inside of it. But if we were to come back to Acumatica in our sales order screen, we do see the order 6543 that's created. And if we open it, we do see our 2 items in here, our Acer computer and our Lego set with the quantity of 1 and 2. So it's as simple as this to create a record. You just need to specify in the body the fields. If you're not too sure of the structure to perform, just take a look at one that already exists in the system, perform a GET request on it, and let me just come back right here and copy the structure that you have right here. Inside of the body of your put request, remove the field that you don't want to send, and then you just need to send that request as it is. Though, one thing I recommend when dealing with creating a record is always work in tandem with the UI, as you might want to just see which fields are required, which fields are enabled or disabled. For example, this ordered quantity at the top, you can read it, but it's read-only, so you cannot write to it. If I want to, for example, trigger an action, so in this case it would be the action create shipment for this specific sales order, I can use 2 ways of targeting a specific record. So we have, like I mentioned earlier, the key fields, but once you make a request on a specific record, either to retrieve it or to create it or update it, you will see this system field, which is ID, which contains a GUID value. This value can be used to identify that record uniquely, and you can be used to target that record again, either to update it or create it. So if we were to use this value right here, so the request once again is the same base, so server is the name of the site, entity keyword, name of the endpoint, version of the endpoint, the name of the entity, and the name of the action that we want to target. In this case, if we go back to our web service endpoint, open the action folder, we do see that the sales order create shipment action is already mapped as part of the default endpoint. And inside of it, inside of the body, we need to add like another level for it, which in this case would be the entity, which would relate the necessary information to target a record on which you want the action to be triggered. In this case, we'll be using the ID. And we could also have another section with parameters if we wanted to specify any parameters for a specific action, or if we wanted to change default values of parameters that are being used for this action. So for example, on the sales order screen, if we clicked on the create shipment action, we do see that we need to provide it with some parameters, though they're default values. So in this case, I'm fine with their defaulting value. So I will not be specifying them, and we'll just be specifying enough information to target that record. And now I get back the status 202 accepted. This means that the request that I've just performed was accepted by the system, but has not yet completed. In order to monitor the status of the action, I need to take a look at the headers of the response, and you will have a header that's named location with a strangely familiar URL inside of it. If I were to use this URL in a GET request, base URL, and send it, now I get the status 204 no content, which means that the server has successfully processed the request, which means that our create shipment action was successfully triggered. And if we use the cancel to refresh the data, we do see that our sales order is now in the shipping status. So for example, let me trigger an action that on a shipment that I know would produce an error. Once again, the request will be accepted, but I don't know if it succeeded. So I need to take a look at my headers, copy the information from here, and monitor its status. So as you can see now, instead of a 204, I got the 500 internal server error, which says that the operation is not valid with the current state. So I can go take a look at that specific that specific shipment in order to figure out like what happened for that shipment. If I try to confirm it in the UI, nope. So if I were to try and confirm it, we do see one or more lines have unassigned location and or lot serial number, which of course, like I don't have 100,000 AA machine one in my system in order to ship them. So that's why the error in this case is being triggered. And now if we want to just take a look at how to delete a specific sales order, let me just create a new sales order. In order to delete a sales order, we need to use either the key fields or the ID for that specific order and put it in the URL and send it with the at the proper request. So let me just copy the sales order, which is the 6544. You open the delete request. And if I were to navigate to the sales order screen, right here we do see the 6544. Send the request, so entity keyword default, name of the endpoint, version of the endpoint, the entity, and then we specify the key fields. Send this request right here. With the delete type, we do get the 204 no content, which means successfully processed. Press the cancel to refresh our data, and our sales order just got deleted. Okay, now nearing the end, so let me do two more things. So if we wanted to retrieve a token and use OAuth, we need to first do a step inside of Acumatica, which is use the connected application screen, in which we will define an entry for it. So in this case, I named it DevCon. And when I saved it, it generated a client ID. I decided the OAuth flow that I wanted to use. As you can see, we have a resource owner, password, credential, implicit and authorization code. And I added a shared secret for it. Using all this information, I can go back into my Postman, perform a request with the same start, server name, site name, but instead of entity, it's identity, connect, and token, the proper URL for it, and we need to specify it. So the grant type in our case is the type of flow, which in our case is password. We tell it the client ID, the client secret, the username and the password, as this is the password credential flow, and the scope that we want to use with this token. And if I were to send this token right here, we do see that I get an access token back. It expires in 360 seconds, which is 1 hour. It's a type bearer, and we also have a refresh token, and it tells us the scope that we have used. So now if I were to perform a logout request to get rid of the cookies and try again with, let's see, retrieving this sales order using the key fields, we would of course get the error message that we are not logged in. Though if we were to come right here and get our token value, and inside of our headers right here, oh, it's a bit small. Let me just hide the description column because we do not need it. Add the authorization header and give it the bearer, which is the type of our token with the value of our token, and perform the request again. We do get the values for the token, for the sales order that we had just retrieved without using cookies in this case. Though, once you're done doing a request using a token, I recommend that you perform a logout request so that your session does not stay open until the token expires, which is 1 hour. And this is pretty much it for the demo part. And now just 2 or 3 sneak peek as to new functionalities that are coming in the next version of the default endpoint, which should be released in Acumatica 2022 R2. So we have 4 of them that are confirmed for now, or that are completed, I could say, and others that are being worked on that, of course, since they're not done yet, I cannot disclose them. So we will have the possibility of doing multiple conditions on the same field. We will have implemented the logical operator OR for the REST API. We will have the capability of attaching files to a specific item using the ID field value instead of the key fields. And we will have the possibility of attaching files to detail lines of records. And yes, I think that was pretty much it.